Okay, lastly, let's talk about track time bases. So we learned that MIDI deals in time of, there's ticks, there's 960 ticks per quarter note. Audio, its time base is samples, so a certain number of samples per second. That's the sample rate, right? So on a larger level, virtually all elements are either tick-based, that means they can change with tempo, or they're sample-based, and that means they're absolute. They're fixed to the minutes and seconds timeline. So this applies to rulers, memory locations, and tracks. So understanding how these can be manipulated can be used to your advantage. So sample-based tracks, you'll see that there's this little clock icon that shows us that these are sample-based. And if we had a MIDI track, let's just bring up a instrument track here. By default, instrument tracks are tick-based. So you can see there's time-based selector there is in ticks. So by default, the MIDI tracks and the instrument tracks are tick-based, and everything else basically is sample-based. But we can change those. So the book wants to make sure you understand this. By default, the following track types are sample-based. So audio, aux, master, VCA, routing, folders, and videos are all sample-based. And the only two that are tick-based are MIDI and instrument. And they do have a note here. Basic folder types, being simple containers to other tracks, have no time base, so they're neither sample or tick-based. So basic folders have no time base, but routing folders that have that auxiliary function are sample-based by default. So these defaults work in many situations, but Pro Tools users, particularly MIDI and music production, can rely heavily on changing the tempo. So you might want your tracks to be tick-based, for instance. So let's see, you might want all tracks to be created as tick-based. So there is a preference for that, obviously. Is there a preference for that? Well, probably. So from the setup menu, we choose preferences, then we go to the editing tab, and we look for new tracks default to tick time base. So let's just find tick. New tracks default to tick time base. So if we had that checked, then all tracks can be defaulted to tick time base, and we'll see why that's important here in a second. Each track can change, you can change their time base from the default by just clicking on the time base selector and selecting the desired time base. There is a note here. You'll see this menu also has an option called Selected Changes Alternate Playlists. I guess if we had Selection Changes Alternate Playlists, there we go. This refers to the edit playlists, which are discussed in lesson 4, so the next lesson. Video tracks can only be sample-based, and they do not have that time-based selector. Okay, so let's talk about some workflows that this might be some advantage, or maybe even open up some new possibilities. So we could have sample-based MIDI. So by default, MIDI tracks are tick-based. But let's say we don't want them to change with tempo. Maybe we are, I don't know, maybe these are sound effects for a production that you want these sound effects to happen at a specific time, meaning a minute and second, and you don't want those to be affected by any tempo changes. So you could have your sound effects as sample-based, so they don't change with tempo changes, and have all your other instrument tracks maybe that are doing the music stuff change with tempo. You can have tick-based audio. So for instance, let's see if I have a instrument track here. But you know what? Let's have some fun. Let's drag this into the MIDI track and say let's convert this audio track to MIDI. We can see how this tempo thing changes. Okay, so now here's the guitar track as MIDI. So obviously this is tick-based. So if I change the tempo, then that changes the playback rate of all that MIDI file, but it doesn't change the playback rate of anything that's sample-based. So that's where that comes in. If I made this sample-based and then changed the tempo, of course it's not going to move because now this MIDI is fixed to the minute and seconds, the absolute timeline, minutes and seconds. We can, here's drums, for instance. If we change tempo, which we just did, the drums don't change their playback rate because this is sample-based. Let me put this back to, where was it, 120 before? But let's say we want this to be tick-based. And then we change, here's how this works if I had some separation here. If I now change the tempo to something else, let's make it slow. It doesn't spread out as you would expect it to. Each new clip now then, this start of this clip, which was associated with a bar and beat, now at a slower tempo, has moved it later in time. We could maybe select all of this and go separate clip at transients. There we go. So now each drum hit is now a separate clip. So now when we change tempo, then that spreads it out. And that gets closer to what you would expect, I guess, as a tick-based track to behave to tempo changes. There's even a tempo, you can change this as a tempo map. Right. So time bases and automation. When we discuss track time bases, it is typically to initially think in terms of their effect on things like clips and notes. But the story doesn't end there. Everything on a sample-based track is locked to an absolute location, just like everything on a tick-based track is locked to position relative to the session tempo. This includes automation. Understanding this and how it changes the track time base can be a powerful production skill. So let's say that you're composing within Pro Tools using MIDI and virtual instruments. So tick-based tracks by default. The outputs of these tracks are routed to an auxiliary input track serving as a subgroup master. So maybe my my guitar here. Let's undo all these weirdness there. Let's go back to the original and look at our MIDI track here. All right, let's see what the book's talking about. So let's say that instrument track is then routed to a aux. So this is going to that aux. Come here. Okay. And the instrument track is tick-based by default. The aux is sample-based. Okay. If your instrument track is tick-based and your aux is sample-based, you might run into a problem. If you change the tempo of your session, the MIDI data will move, but the automation data on the sample-based aux would not. So if I had some volume changes, for instance, that wanted to happen at specific parts of the music, let's say, and now I change the tempo, so my MIDI changes, but the MIDI that's going to this aux track does not change because this is sample-based. But what if we put this on tick-based and now change the tempo? So now that the automation breakpoints now follow the MIDI because both of these are on the bars and beats timeline. So they're both tick-based. So you have to remember that that these things, even the automation, everything is then either sample-based or tick-based per track.